I'm turning the gain on my mic down, so if I sound a little quieter now, that's why. Do I sound quieter, Joe?
You sound much louder.
Much louder?
Did you turn it down or up?
It's upside. It's hanging upside down. It's very confusing. How do I sound?
That checks out. Yeah, quieter.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Welcome to Science Sort of. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science. It's Joe B, the Joe Ban.
Hello, everyone. How are you today?
The carpenter. Are you a carpenter?
A poor one.
I mean, tis the season for Josephs who are carpenters, right?
Yeah, I guess so. We're getting there.
No, you're more of a metal guy. So you're less of a wood guy.
I mean, to be honest, in college I worked as an electrician, so
I did not know that.
Yeah. Did electrical construction.
I might hit you up for some jobs I have around the house because I need some help.
I mean, I've done it before.
But what I need help with at the moment is this week's episode, the theme of which is the extinction of fossil fuels. What do you think about that theme, Joe?
Got them.
We got them? What do you mean?
We got those. We got the fossil fuels. Got them. They're extinct.
I wish. If only it were that easy.
Oh, is it not? Dang.
Turns out it's a little bit more complicated than that. So Joe and I are being joined by two writers for the October National Geographic issue, The Revolution Is Here, Craig Welch and Sam Halver-Hovick. Thank you both for joining us. Just to give a little bit extra intro for both of you, Craig is a senior staff writer for Nat Geo and Nat Geo Magazine, tackling issues of climate change. He also considers himself a bad angler, an enthusiastic trail runner, and a soccer nut. And Sam Verhoevick, you are a journalist, former national correspondent for the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, and you are the author of the book Jet Age, in addition to an article in the October issue of Nat Geo. So thank you both for joining us here on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So a question I have for both of you to kind of kick off the discussion here is, for an issue like this, where you've got this, idea for a theme that several articles in the magazine are going to be centered around, how does that come together? Did each of you pitch a story, or does an editor reach out to you and solicit something from you? Or how does the sort of high concept of the issue dictate the scope of what you're planning on writing for the magazine?
Well, I can start. This is Craig. So I think there's often a bit of just fortuitousness involved. I had pitched a story about the future of transportation, meaning cars, because there was just so much happening. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that it just so happens that Sam had pitched separately an entirely related story about the future of flight. And as soon as I pitched a story to my editor, he talked around our shop and it's like, well, wait, there's a lot going on in this topic and somebody else has heard from Sam. So I believe that's how this package initially started. Is that correct, Sam?
That's my understanding. I know that the editor-in-chief, Susan Goldberg, kept referring to it as the planes, trains, and automobiles issue, but we wound up not having very much on trains. Although there was discussion, interestingly, about whether we would include a section on, trains and hyperloops and whatever. And then, what about ocean freighters, which burn bunker oil and are thus a huge contributor to climate change? And I think the feeling was just that started getting a little too kind of unwieldy. And we had these two sort of good, strong topics to tackle. Craig, do you remember when somebody came up with the term that our stories were sort of yin and yang to each other?
Yes, I do. I do.
Yeah. I can't remember who that was, if it was Rob or maybe John, or these are two editors of ours. Sorry, I should have said that. The yin and yang just refers to the fact that while Craig was writing about kind of the revolution on the ground, all of these amazing things going on with cars, I was writing sort of at the other end about all the things that are sort of not going on in a way in commercial aviation. It's everything that's a revolution on the ground is very, very hard to translate into a commercial airliner carrying a couple hundred people across an ocean. That's just the reality.
And that actually kind of brings up the next question that I had. So it sounds like you two came up with the ideas for your articles independent of one another and sort of worked on them on your own. Is that correct? Am I understanding the workflow there?
Yes.
Well, for me, actually, it was funny. I had pitched the idea of a story just about sort of the future generation of airliners, what they might look like and how green might they be. And I had made a big point to my editor that, at least in my view, the whole issue of so-called flight shaming, which is not so big in the United States, but is a pretty big deal in Europe. The idea that flying is extremely carbon intensive, and for a lot of us, the single thing that we could the single thing we could do personally that would have the biggest impact on our contribution to climate change would be to decide not to fly. But I had the brilliant timing to to propose this idea like 2 months before COVID hit. And once COVID hit, it's like, aviation sort of fell off the map in a way.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting synchronicity that happened there for sure.
Yeah.
I've thought about that while reading your article for sure. The term in the article is a Swedish word, flygskam,
right,
which sounds like something you would get from IKEA.
It does. No. I think it's Greta Thunberg's, or at least she is a big proponent of the idea of flygskam. She sailed across the ocean to go speak to the United Nations a few years ago.
Well, my wife is of Swedish heritage, and she's one of the only people I know who refers to IKEA products by their name that IKEA gives them, as if that's the name everyone should obviously know them by.
Right, that's right. Right.
She's like, "Oh, Ryan, the Billy bookcase is back in stock." Like, oh, okay, I don't know what that means.
Actually, this makes me curious to know, Craig, do you get any sense that there will be car shaming in the future if somebody is not driving an electric car, at least a hybrid?
So a little bit of a backstory. Before I wrote this piece, I did a story for the 2020 Earth Day issue, which was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, where I drove across country with a photographer in a series of electric cars.
Right.
And the idea for that story was essentially to look at all of the ways the energy system is changing. And as part of that, we more than once saw sort of the reverse of what Sam is talking about, where we saw people with big diesel vehicles trying to, they call it rolling coal, where they basically eject enormous blasts of diesel exhaust on cars that annoy them in some ways. And in both cases, in one case, it was a Prius, and in the other case, it was a big tractor trailer hauling a wind turbine. So that's ironic. I'm assuming that there may be shaming in the future, but for now, it seems
it's just the reverse.
It's just the reverse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
You also get it with blocking out electric car charging spots. You'll have pickup trucks that'll park in the electric charging spots just to block the electric cars from charging.
That happened on our trip in Tucumcari, New Mexico. We pulled into the only charging station we could find, and there was an F-250 blocking all of the charging.
Sadly, not surprised.
That's
wow.
Just, come on.
That's wild. I see, because to me, my vision of an EV future, and this is already kind of getting off the rails a little bit, but welcome to our show, is that I always kind of imagine that for the gearheads in the world that exist, that you would have your electric commuter car that is smart and gets good mileage and is easy to drive. And then if you're the kind of person who really loves driving or off-roading, you would have a vehicle dedicated to that, but it wouldn't be the vehicle you use every day. I mean, the thing that always flummoxes me is when you're driving around and you see the perfectly pristinely clean pickup truck. And I'm just like, well, why do you have that car? Because it should be covered in mud.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've seen this, but Ford is now looking at developing I think it's like a 1968 or 1972 Ford pickup with an electric engine. So they're basically trying to do retro electric cars to basically capture the people who are interested in that market.
Yeah, I'm not remembering if it's GM or Ford that just released it, but one of the two, for years they've both sold crate motors to the hot rodding community. Yep. And one of the two of them just released a crate motor, but it's an electric drive unit. Mm-hmm. And so it's like $3,900, but it's an electric motor that'll drop into whatever retrofit installation you want to do with it.
Craig, did you guys consider letting the air out of the truck's tires? I mean,
I'm not sure my employment at National Geographic would continue as such.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But wow. I hadn't realized that there's that.
And so a thing that I thought of while I was reading your article, Craig, is that one benefit that's often touted for electric vehicles is that they are mechanically a simpler machine with fewer moving parts, fewer things that can go wrong than combustion engine cars. And I think that often gets touted as a benefit, but I think kind of what our discussion here is illuminating is that for many people, gearheads, off-roaders, whatever, that it might actually be seen as a disadvantage because part of the joy of owning a combustion engine vehicle is the tinkering. Mm-hmm. And so have you thought at all about sort of like, how do you circle that square to like make sure that these are still machines that people can tinker with and play with in those kind of ways?
I not specifically that, but I think what you're hitting on is something that is a bigger picture issue than I see discussed really anywhere, which is shortly after the story came out, we do an email newsletter to, I think it's a couple million people. And we sent out a question about, would you buy an electric car if all things being equal, if it had, sort of enough charging capacity and the price was right. And I can't remember what the figures were, but it was something like, 68% said yes. And so what is the reason that other 30% would say no? And I think part of it is culture that, there's so much around driving and being an American and, there's so much wrapped into our identities with the vehicles that we have. And I don't know how you bridge that gap because there's so much there.
Right. Why is Han Solo cooler than Luke Skywalker? Because Han Solo has a hot rod. Like
yes.
It's literally.
Yes. Also, there's got to be some percentage of people who feel that because you can now gas up your car in 2.5 or 3 minutes, until electric chargers can do the equivalent, they're probably going to say, no, I don't want that. I mean, we're a fast food nation. We're a fast moving nation. I'm sure that some percentage of people will say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think Tesla's had some really interesting innovations in that space where like now you can literally pull up Netflix in your Tesla and watch an episode of a television show while, you can watch the capitalist hellscape Squid Game while recharging your electric vehicle. And like the processing on Tesla is now good enough that you can play like Xbox games on a Tesla. So I think innovations like that are going to be really helpful in helping some people cross that threshold into the time it takes to charge up an electric vehicle.
The other key is going to be just communicating that, generally speaking, you're going to leave your house with your electric vehicle fully charged, right? Whereas like your gas car, you have to take it to the gas station every week to fill it up. Every day you start your electric drive with a full charge. So most people won't be using the public charging stations. And that's just communications.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of sort of the way you drive an electric car is different. I mean, not only do you just do most of your charging at home, but you typically, when you go to fill up your gas car, you go when you're near empty and you fill it all the way up. And what we learned driving across country in electric cars, after a while, you start to find the rhythm of charging that last, charging 25% at a time so that it doesn't take forever. And I do think there are a lot of innovations coming. I mean, even between the time when I filed that story and when it was published, there are battery advancements already that are chipping away at the time it takes to actually charge a car. So I think that kind of advancement is coming, and it's coming very fast.
Yeah, definitely. Hyundai, Kia, and Porsche are both moving towards 800 volt charging systems, which is going to start speeding things up as that gets adopted.
Craig, does the Ford F-150 that is electric, will it have a lower weight carrying capacity than the internal combustion one because the batteries are so heavy, or not?
That is a very good question, but I can't say for certain, but my assumption is no, because that is not, I mean, I've heard a lot of discussion about that truck, and that is not a criticism I've heard. In fact, I've heard a lot of people who use trucks for work are quite excited about the F-150 because it does so much more than a gas-powered vehicle does.
Right, well, because the way the torque works on an electric vehicle is completely different than a gas vehicle, right?
Yep.
Yeah, apparently you go from 0 to 60 and, boom, just like that.
Well, when you don't have a transmission, that sort of thing becomes possible.
What's interesting is that for flight, for airplanes, the electric space it's happening, but only in a very small segment of the market, which is basically small planes traveling short hops. And it is so striking how heavy the batteries are in these planes. The first all-electric airliner that's been ordered that carries, I think, 9 passengers, 60% of the weight of the entire plane is the battery, or is the batteries. There are many batteries. And that's just a limiting factor in flight that nobody's kind of figured out a way to get around it for airliners of any great size.
Well, Sam, you had what was the figure you had for what it would cost to fly from the US to London?
Yeah, an engineer in Britain calculated for me that it would take basically the power of 4.4 million ordinary laptop batteries just to get a 747 off the ground, except that you never could get it off the ground because those batteries would weigh 7 times the weight of the plane itself. And I thought that was a neat sort of illustration of just how difficult the battery challenge is. I mean, the density of liquid fuel is so much more efficient, per ounce than the best battery in the world is right now. And it's not to say some, genius won't figure out a way in the future to fly an airplane the size of a 747 across the ocean, but nobody's close to that yet.
Right. And one of the reasons that electric vehicles work in ways that are fun to drive is because, a high performance vehicle, the main concern that you have when it's built to be super aerodynamic is keeping it on the ground. And so a really heavy battery is a benefit, whereas an aerodynamic vehicle that you want to actually be in the air, a really heavy battery is a disadvantage.
Yes. Yeah. Gravity is a really, really stubborn thing. It turns out it's a big problem.
Yeah, you have to burn a lot of your energy just to fight gravity with the airplane, right?
Yep.
Converting thrust into lift.
So what about Zeppelins?
So actually, Craig, this is one area where I was kind of upset that we lost a sidebar in the end, because I was doing a story about there are people who are now designing airships that sort of go back to the Zeppelin days. They're very energy efficient, and I think they would be wonderful to fly because it truly is a bird's eye view. You're like, 1,000 feet over the ground or whatever, but they won't go particularly fast. So, people are going to have to be okay with it taking 2 or 3 days to get over to London. I'd be fine with that myself, but
I will tell you, inside National Geographic, there was some discussion even a couple of years ago about whether or not Zeppelins are going to make a comeback. And because people are designing them and working on them, and it just, I think they couldn't get past the laugh out loud stage from the editors higher on the food chain.
So the other thing about it that's interesting is hydrogen, has gotten a bad rap ever since the Hindenburg. The thing that I heard from a number of engineers that sort of defended hydrogen as a fuel was the notion that the crash of the Hindenburg that we've all seen, on tape, and the radio announcer saying that, the humanity, the thing that really caused the flames that were so massive were the cotton sacks that basically served as fuel tanks for hydrogen. That was really the thing that made it into a super duper explosion.
It also had paint that turned it into basically thermite.
Yeah, exactly. It had like an aluminum oxide paint or something like that.
Yep.
That they did purely for aesthetics, so that it would look better with the Nazi color scheme. And so
yeah.
As long as we're not going back to those aesthetic choices, maybe there's a chance.
So one of these companies claims that one of their first routes is going to be from Seattle to Vancouver, which is not a particularly heavily traveled route, but I'm very happy about that because both Craig and I happen to live in Seattle, and I would gladly take a Zeppelin to Vancouver over any other possible form of transport.
It sounds like you need to take electric motorcycles on a Zeppelin from Seattle to Vancouver and then drive back on the electric motorcycles, and that's your next story, right?
That would be great. That would be great.
Sign me up.
Yeah.
You should also get a hop in the that electric seaplane company that's getting going up in
that sounded
Seattle.
Really cool.
That is in Vancouver. And actually the thing that's cool about there are 2 airlines that are sort of leading the way toward all electric flight. And they both happen to be airlines whose bread and butter is very short hops. One is a seaplane commuter airline in Vancouver that is retrofitting a whole fleet of like 65-year-old de Havilland beavers with electric engines. And if you think about it, most of BC's power comes from hydropower. So you have the possibility that you could get on that plane and take a trip, and it could be not only zero emission at the source, but truly zero emission if it's hydropower. And similarly, Cape Air on Cape Cod could potentially get all its energy from Vineyard Wind, which is a huge offshore wind project, and that could be the same thing. And I think that would be really cool to be able to take a flight that is truly zero emission. I mean, that's astonishing.
Yeah, I think that would be amazing to have that option for folks.
And no Fliegskam. You wouldn't have any Fliegskam with that.
Well, the hydropower is not without its own ecological impacts, but we won't. We actually that does bring me to a question that a thought that I had while reading these articles, but I wasn't able to formulate it into a question. And so I'll say my thought, and then if you have thoughts in addition to that, I would love to hear them. I spent a year here in DC doing a science policy fellowship, and so a lot of reading these articles almost touched less on my science background and more on my policy background, just because I've heard a lot of the discussions that were being had in your articles, including some of the same people, about how do we decarbonize the future and the immense challenges and the last mile to market issues that come up. And one of the big ones that comes up over and over again are the ethical concerns when it comes to the way we mine the minerals that produce the batteries that power electric vehicles, but whether they're in the sky or on the ground. And there's one side of there's one group of people who say maybe we should be mining these minerals in the US, but the communities in the US that are near where these mineral resources are don't want mines because we have this horrible history of mining companies not treating the communities near their mines very well. And so there's a lot of skepticism involved that kind of pushes back against those mines happening. And at the same time, it's not like continuing to use fossil fuels doesn't also come with a body count. And the body count is going to impact the same communities that are also unethically producing the mineral from these mines. So like, how do we come to grips with sort of the need to get these minerals, but make sure that we're getting them in a way that's ethical and not doing as much or more harm than would be done if we just continue to burn fossil fuels?
I'd given that quite a bit of thought too, and I talked to quite a few people when I was doing the reporting for this story about that very issue. So a couple of things surprised me. One, I guess I had not been aware that, lithium in particular, there are gobs and gobs of lithium available. So it's not a difficult to come by resource. There's lithium on every continent. The other thing that surprised me is that I think in part because of why this transition is taking place, that at root, we're being driven by environmental concerns, that there is a lot more upfront discussion among companies in and around the European Union in particular about doing having some kind of third party way of making sure that mines are environmentally at least better than the way mining's been done for the last several thousand years, and better on human rights. Whether or not that works, I don't know, but I mean, at least there is this effort being made to have the Volkswagens of the world have to answer for where they're getting their minerals, and because they're making this transition to make the environment cleaner, that they would love to not be part of the problem if they can avoid that bad PR.
One thing I can throw out just from the space industry, one of the ways that space entrepreneurs think that they will make money in the future is from mining in space, particularly mining on asteroids, many of which actually, have the minerals that we're looking for. I have no idea when that will be, and I think nobody really knows if it's truly economically feasible. It's interesting. The book value of all the minerals out there on the asteroids we can reach is, like in the trillions of dollars. But obviously, if we ever started mining it on a large scale, that would probably quickly bring the price down in a supply.
Right, exactly. I mean, you bring $1 trillion platinum asteroid to Earth, suddenly platinum's not going to be worth $1 trillion. Yeah. I also can't help but think back. There's the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons.
Yeah.
beautifully rotoscoped animated cartoons from the early 40s. And one of my favorite ones is about this scientist who wants to get a closer look at a passing comet. And so he builds a magnetic telescope to pull the comet to Earth. And then, of course, things go wrong from there. And I just can't help but thinking, like, how does asteroid mining not end with us getting hit with an asteroid?
Yeah. No, it's totally possible. It's wild. But again, there's serious people who say that there's money to be made. They say that the world's first trillionaire is going to be a space entrepreneur, but sort of by definition, that trillionaire is going to have to invest hundreds of billions of dollars of money into getting there. So it's a pretty select field of people that will really jump into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this sort of comes down to a recognition that, like, the battles that people are going through now with climate change, it's not like there comes a point where all of this ends.
Right.
That we're going to be there's going to be required vigilance from here into eternity. I mean, people are going to have to just keep demanding that, whatever we're doing meets ever higher and higher standards.
And I feel like that's the price we pay for not having been vigilant up to recently.
Absolutely.
Well, so what if I told you with aviation that there is no radical new design for a big commercial airliner that's going to come online in, I'm not kidding, probably 3 decades at the earliest. So we'll still be flying around in planes that use liquid fuel. They may be flying, and this is the industry's big push, on so-called sustainable aviation fuel, which still emits carbon, but as part of the life cycle of creating the fuel, you sequester carbon at the outset, or you consume carbon. And so it's ultimately less of a net contributor of carbon than, traditional fossil kerosene, but it still will be a contributor. And I think that aviation is going to be struggling with this. And, it will be a question as to whether aviation will be sort of, taking your vacation to Paris, which used to be something we'd all like to boast about to our friends. Maybe you'll have to do it on the sly or something. You don't want your friends to know that you've flown 6,000 miles and back.
And I thought about that while I was reading the article, because you referenced that the airline industry has all these projections about how much more people will be flying in the future, and the 80% of people on the planet who've never been on a plane, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah.
And, I'm wondering if, like, a combination of the flight shaming actually does work to sort of disincentivize air travel. So maybe people are more willing to go on road trips if they have a self-driving car. They don't have to, like, actually pay attention the whole time. They can take a nap and end up in Yellowstone. I also think, like, we never addressed the root causes of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, like, there could be another pandemic that we're dealing with.
Right.
And so what if, and those all might kind of coalesce into a situation where people who care about this stuff see flight as an unnecessary luxury that's also quite risky. And so what if the airlines are wrong and the demand never materializes? And so there's not, like, a profit margin to even fund the sort of green initiatives that they have in their pie in the sky notions.
Then they have a huge problem. And,
Okay.
Part of the problem for the airlines is that they make their decisions about investing in, new airliners. They make them years out, and, they often commit a huge amount of money to buying a certain number of airliners. And they can renegotiate the contract and maybe take fewer, but basically they have to pony up some serious dough. The estimates that you're talking about, I thought it was interesting. The industry points to the fact that aviation historically has averaged about 5% a year in growth, in passenger miles flown, year in, year out. That's the average. Sometimes there are dips, like in the 2008 recession. It dipped, but it quickly caught up again. Now then you have COVID, in which it just plummeted, but they are still confident that not only are they going to catch up to past levels, but they're going to start assuming that 5% growth a year again, as more and more of the 80% of people who've never flown, people in China, people in India, places where there are emerging middle classes, they will want to fly. And so the industry thinks that the demand will be there. Now, whether the shaming will be there is a huge question. I thought it was interesting, actually, that the industry doesn't. You could make a case that if I were the head of all the the association that represents all the airlines, you could say something to the effect of, look, aviation contributes about 2.5% of carbon every year that's emitted. And, it's the hardest segment by far to decarbonize. So maybe you can cut us a little bit of a break and not put super duper, demands on us. I don't think they're going to say that. And I don't think that they would really get away with that message. But it surprised me that more people aren't saying it.
And that sort of brings me to an idea I had when it comes to like the reputation of air travel, because there's a joke in your article about how there's this description of getting to sort of hop around in this very small, light, nimble electric vehicle. And you said that sounds really fun. And that made me think about the fact that, like, in the early days of air travel, it was luxurious. It was something you put a suit on. I'm old enough to remember when my parents made me dress up to get on a plane.
Yeah.
And then it transitioned from that to being, how many sardines can we pack in the can? And then from that, with the COVID era, now if I got on a plane, I'd be constantly worried that somebody who hates vaccines and hates masks is going to start a fight and somebody might actually get hurt. Right. And so, like, that's a pretty steep reputation decline in the sort of prestige and glamour of air travel. And how do you think an industry recovers from that sort of blow to what it means to be a person who gets on a plane?
Look, a lot of people don't particularly like to fly. I'm a weird exception. Ever since I was a little kid, I've always loved flying and I love looking out the window and so forth. People fly because they want to get from one place to another. They fly because they want to go see their relatives or their friends, or they want to travel to Europe for a vacation, or, they want to go to China. So that desire will still be there. And I don't think that the hassles or the inconvenience of flying are going to be so great that would necessarily deter people. Maybe today it deters them. A lot of people that I know aren't, if you offered them a free ticket to fly someplace, they wouldn't particularly want to do it because of COVID concerns. But, again, I think that will change in the future, unless, as you say, a new virus comes along, or this virus gets worse again and people just feel, that they would never feel comfortable flying. But I doubt that happens.
The thing that the airlines, still have on their side and still will have on their side for, frankly, probably decades to come, is their product, their service that they provide isn't matched by anything else available, certainly not in the United States. I thought it was interesting in your article, you mentioned that I think it was France that banned any flight shorter than like 2 hours in the country.
They banned any flight between two cities that you could get from one to the other in 2.5 hours or less on a train.
Gotcha.
But if you think about it, that's actually not that many flights in France. And in the United States, given the state of our passenger rail industry, I don't know if there's any flight currently operating to which that sort of restriction would apply.
Right. That's what I was kind of getting at is in the United States, that restriction basically doesn't apply because you can't, there is no alternative to air travel.
I wish there was. I mean, I think that high-speed rail makes sense in certain corridors. It makes sense in Florida, where there already is, I think, a pretty successful private, I don't know if it's super high speed, but it's relatively fast. And Texas,
Florida's also flat. And Texas is also relatively flat.
Yeah, well, but Texas has sort of, if you look at the map, there's kind of this triangle from Dallas to Austin/San Antonio to Houston that everybody now flies. Southwest Airlines, you've got to schlep out, to the airport and go through security, and you get on the plane, and it's only 20 minutes, but the whole process takes you a certain amount of time. A good, fast, comfortable train could be very competitive with that. But that would be a huge investment. That's one of the things that's deterred it, obviously.
Yeah, we've been trying to get the high-speed rail line down here in California from San Francisco to LA for forever.
Well, that right now is sort of has been killed or not? I mean, I know there's one section of it.
It's on again, off again. They're trying to get a section from, no offense to the people in these cities, but nowhere to nowhere, basically like Merced to Bakersfield.
How dare
which is
you,
just
Joe?
Really.
I know.
But like as a test run, or just because it was easier to build track
Just because
there?
it's easier. Yeah, it's the Central Valley portion that's long, straight, flat, with nothing impeding it. You know, when you get down towards LA, there's mountains that you got to figure out, and same up towards San Francisco, there's mountains and people you got to figure out. So the easy section's in the middle, so they started there, and that's been running over cost and over schedule.
Craig, were you looking at the Hyperloop at one point? I thought we had a conversation.
No.
Okay.
I mean, one of the part of the reason we did not end up writing about rail is because there really is just so little happening in the U.S. There just isn't a great movement to have some kind of European-like system, you know. And the listening to this part of the discussion, what I keep thinking about is that, you know, one of the frustrations I have seeing how carbon offsetting is being talked about and used is that I think something like flight is what offsets should be used for, and they should not be used for so many of the ways they are being used. I mean, and that assumes that we can figure out a way to make them work. But I mean, I think carbon offsetting should be limited as a tool for things that cannot be done another way.
I love that point, Craig. And I also think that like so much of the carbon offsetting that's being proposed by larger corporations is like, we'll plant X many trees, as if trees are a panacea to carbon emissions, and they're simply not. And it's also, you know, diminishing returns. It depends on where you plant. There's so many factors. It depends on where you plant the trees, what kinds of trees, the lifespan of the trees. And
the Los Angeles Times actually had a really good article semi-recently about carbon offsets and how they're problematic, and you can sell land for carbon offsets, but you can then cut down the trees anyway. There's problems with it.
I was surprised that there's a huge amount of hostility to carbon offsets in the environmental community. I think a lot of people feel that they are sort of worse than useless because it's like getting an indulgence from the Catholic Church. It's designed to allay your guilt, but they think that they don't really work.
Yeah, it makes you feel good, and it makes you able to advertise that you're
But do you disagree
good
with that attitude, Sam? Or is
So it's funny. One of the things that I did discuss with my editor, they sometimes in a story like this, they want to have a little box that says to the reader, you know, here's what you can do to help solve the problem, kind of thing. And I said that if we're going to recommend carbon offsets, I just felt very strongly that you have to, you know, give the reader some context for why these things are a little problematic and why some people think that they're sort of bordering on fraudulent. And we kind of went back and forth on that and ultimately decided not to do the box because it just was going to take up too much space. I think that, you know, for me personally, I think paying for carbon offsets is probably better than nothing, but I do understand the problems with it. And I understand the sort of, you know, the way that it again, allays guilt, but doesn't really solve the problem to the degree that the people selling them suggest.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's sort of an out of sight, out of mind problem. Like I get on a flight from DC to San Francisco,
right,
and I pay X premium extra amount on my ticket for a carbon offset. And so I'm supposed to have faith in an airline that like I wouldn't trust with my dog in steerage to plant trees in Bolivia to make sure all the carbon from this flight is offset. Like it doesn't pass muster in terms of like what I expect from a corporation to do in a socially responsible manner, I guess.
Well, there's no question that some carbon offsets are basically, you know, totally fraudulent. Some are very well intended and do, you know, they do things like they do plant trees, they do invest in, you know, wind projects and so forth. But again, whether it's a straight, you know, 1-for-1 exchange and you really truly are offsetting the huge amount of carbon you're putting in the air by flying, I think that's highly debatable. There's a guy in my story, by the way, who runs a website called noflyclimatesci.org. And the guy's a climate scientist. And he just decided several years ago, he thought that it was unethical to fly. He said, we don't really need to fly. And he particularly called out his colleagues in the climate community, like, why are we all flying around to these conferences consuming a huge amount of carbon in order to warn the world about the huge amount of carbon that we're consuming? And it's, it was an interesting point.
Yeah, and we interviewed a group of students from UC San Diego a couple of years ago about taking the train to meetings, but climate-focused meetings, and it's interesting, and for even on the scale of the continental US, it mostly works. You have to travel almost the entire distance of the continent before the carbon offsets, the carbon footprint of a train ride matches that of a plane ride. So there's something to be said for it, but it's the point of convenience and the way that we're all sort of pushed to the limit in what we're expected to do with our day-to-day lives is something I'm sympathetic to. It would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also take a break briefly to talk about what we are drinking. Now, I would not recommend that you have a drink while operating an electric vehicle, be it a car or something terrestrial, or a plane, something avionic. Maybe a Zeppelin you could get away with, but even still, I think just sobriety when operating a moving vehicle is probably your best call. But Joe and I are not operating moving vehicles. We are sitting in front of microphones alone at home. And so I can't see Joe. So I don't know what Joe's drinking. So Joe, would you like to tell me?
I'll tell you that the FAA would frown upon operating a Zeppelin whilst inebriated.
Well, what if we get out over international waters?
I guess fair game. I mean, it's probably still a bad idea, but it's a Zeppelin. Like things can't go that bad that fast.
Oh, the humanity. What are you having?
So when we recorded our episode, our interview, I think I had a latte. But tonight, as we record this, I am having a glass of eggnog.
Whoa.
With some brandy even splashed in it.
Joe, I didn't know you were an eggnog guy.
I like eggnog. It's tasty.
Well, I know I said I wanted to hang out while you're in town, but
no more. Is that off? Things
are real busy around the holidays. I don't know if we're gonna have time to get together. Is a store-bought eggnog, or are you a homemade eggnog? Okay, have you made eggnog before? Because Patrick has often advocated that homemade eggnog is agreeable.
I've not made homemade eggnog. I've had homemade eggnog. It is
eggnog
good.
Feels like one of those things. Okay, so I'm a person who eats basically anything. I have very few foods that I dislike to the point where I will prefer not to eat them. Mm-hmm. The two foods that get me, I don't love a cucumber-based pickle. I like almost every other kind of pickle.
What does that even mean? The only pickles I know are cucumber-based.
There's a lot of other kind of pickles out there.
I guess I'm just like blind, pickle blind.
Carrot? You can have a pickled turnip, pickled beet.
All of that seems wrong.
What else? Cabbage? Kimchi? Is kimchi not a pickle, Joe?
Ugh, man, this is like is a taco a sandwich discussion.
Taco is not a sandwich.
No, a taco is actually a sub.
A quesadilla might be a sandwich.
A quesadilla is a sandwich. A taco is a sub.
A quesadilla is a panini. Or is a panini a quesadilla? Anyway, the point is cucumber pickles I struggle with. Love a pickled pepper. I don't care how many Peter Piper picked. I love them. Don't love a pickled cucumber. I've tried all the varieties. I've tried your half sours. I've tried your bread and butters. I've tried your dill. They just I'll eat them. I'm not gonna like kick them out of bed, but they're not my preferred pickled situation.
Interesting.
The other food that I don't really like that much is eggnog. Because I try it every year. I'm like, okay, maybe this is the year, because like it seems like it should be good. It's like a creamy beverage, and you like sip it and you put booze in it. And I just never, for whatever reason, the flavor that I'm anticipating, I think I'm anticipating like hot boozy horchata, and it never tastes like that.
It's not hot boozy horchata. It's a very different thing.
But maybe it should be, because horchata is pretty good.
I mean, you could make boozy horchata.
Well, so my family never traditionally did like a hot boozy situation for Christmas time, and my wife's family does glug, which is like a Scandinavian mulled wine. And I love a glass of glug or a mug of glug.
Mug of glug.
Yeah. Have you had glug?
I've had mulled wine.
But have you had glug?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, we'll make sure we have some. Listen, if you bring what you think is your like best representation of eggnog with you when we hang out, and we will have some glug ready for you to grok, and we'll figure out who's winning the hot Christmas time beverage game.
I mean, eggnog is not hot. You know that, right?
Is it not hot? Do you drink it cold?
You can drink it cold.
Have I been doing it wrong?
Maybe that's the problem. Are you like microwaving your eggnog?
Yeah, I thought it was gravy. But you don't have cold gravy. I thought it was like a Christmas sweet gravy.
I almost spat eggnog all over my microphone.
Okay, well, Joe, I will give you a hot mug of glug, and then you can tell me what I'm doing wrong with eggnog, and see if you can convince me. And maybe we'll record it. Maybe we'll turn the mic on. Who knows?
All right, maybe.
What
are you having? Yeah.
Opening the can. This is a beer from Screech Owl Brewing, which is in Brewston Mills, West Virginia, which is a town in West Virginia. I love the name of it. My dad's name is Bruce. My mom's maiden name is Mills. So it's like my parents got together and created a town in northern West Virginia. And then a brewery showed up there, and it's called Screech Owl Brewing. And this is their Class 3 Whitewater IPA India Pale Ale. And a thing that's really cool about this brewery is that they, in the non-COVID times, use their facility, all their spent grain they use to make like pizza dough. And they have like a pizza place at their brewery that's spent grain pizza. Are you familiar with this concept, Joe? Like the spent grain pizza movement?
I feel like I've heard of such a thing.
So yeah, this is their Class 3 Whitewater IPA, and Julie and I really love whitewater rafting in West Virginia. It's one of my, it's maybe my favorite way to spend a day. Have you done much whitewater rafting, Joe?
I've done what we described as green water rafting on the Youghiogheny River in western Pennsylvania.
Sure.
I believe it's the Middle Yacht, as they call it, is a relatively calmish section with some light rapids. Did that years ago when I was a kid with my family. We had a cabin up on the Youghiogheny Lake.
Does that get up to Class 3?
I don't know how high it gets. I believe the lower Yacht is the strongest rapids. It might be the upper Yacht. I don't know. There's upper, middle, and lower. The middle is the calmest portion. The upper and lower get a little bit more exciting. But as a kid, I never really got into the exciting bits.
Well, I love whitewater rafting, and I love breweries, and I love spent grain. Yeah, I love using the spent grain for something. Abe has actually given me some of his spent grain when he makes beer using, full grain extraction instead of the barley syrup extract. You can, like when you're brewing beer, you can either start from whole grains, or you can just get barley syrup and use the syrup that's already been created for the purposes of brewing. And Class 3, the Class 3 is, it I think is where it starts to get real, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Class 1, like a burble in the river is sort of a Class 1. Class 2 is like, okay, there's like maybe an obstacle you have to navigate around. Class 3 is like, all right, this is the stage at which the water is dangerous enough that you really ought to know what you're doing. And then Class 4 is like, hang on. And then Class 5 is like, oh God. Right. And then Class 6 is like, get off the river. Like, what are you doing?
What are you doing?
That's a waterfall. So this is a very good beer, and it references a lot of things that I really like. I like owls. I like spent grain. I like IPAs. I like whitewater rafting.
Nice. So are they making, going back to the pizza, I have a question. So do they just mash the grain and make flour out of the spent grain? Is that the idea?
So what I've done, because of COVID, I actually haven't been able to go and get pizza from this place. I've only been able to buy their beer and then leave. When Abe has given me his spent grain, I basically blitz it in the food processor to try to pulverize it a little bit so it's a little smaller. And then I basically just knead it into a pizza dough. So like I cut some of the flour out of a pizza dough and then just knead in the spent grain and then let it ferment and chill like I would a normal pizza dough. And it definitely doesn't have like the same fluffy rise and bounce as like an all flour pizza dough, but it has like a nuttiness and like a molasses almost flavor to it that you don't get from normal pizza dough. And it's very good.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've made a lot of pizzas with Abe's spent grain, and I would love to someday try the pizzas at Screech Owl and get to drink the beer straight from the tap instead of in the can. So thank you, Screech Owl, for the fine work you're doing. And I think it's a very sustainable practice. I think those sustainable practices are in line with a lot of what our guests are talking about in the second part of our interview about the greening of transportation. How do we move Joe from point A to point B while emitting as little carbon as possible?
It's electric. Boogie, woogie, woogie, woogie.
Getting back to cars a little bit, something I really wanted to ask you about, Craig, is I feel like when I was a kid, I remember there was a lot of hubbub around this solar-powered car driving across the Australian outback. And I remember it as a kid thinking, oh my God, this is it. This is the future. And then nothing happened.
You're like, where's our jetpack?
And now there is this Aterra company. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm pronouncing it as I would pronounce it as a scientist, where the P is silent. Or,
I assume so. That sounds right.
It literally means wingless. I don't know if folks knew that. I only know that from knowing insect orders. So it seems like maybe we're back on track with the solar powered cars. But like, do you have any insight on what happened there and why we never got the solar powered car future I was hoping for as a child?
I wish I had the definitive answer for you, but I think it's a lot more complicated to get enough power from solar panels to do cars, because cars are so heavy. I think it's really that simple. But I do think we're sort of in this push-pull tug right now about whether or not we're going to be getting super futuristic looking vehicles like, the Cybertruck, or whether or not we're going to have, the Ford 1972 F whatever, the original. And I think you're going to see a little bit of both. And the vehicle you're talking about it's three-wheeled and it's relatively cheap and it's super light and it's powered by solar panels. But I don't know how you would do that with something that is somewhat similar to what we're used to. And I think that's part of this is, it's easier to get somebody to go and buy an electric F-150 than it is to get somebody to go buy something that looks like an insect on wheels. And
I wonder if you almost go, and I wonder if you almost go in the other direction of like, don't say that the Aterra is a downgrade from your Ford 150. Say that it's an upgrade from your electric bike. Because to me, a piece that was missing feels like I'm making a judgmental statement about your article, okay. but I feel like the role of electric bicycles in the future of especially urban transportation wasn't really touched on in your article. And I know that
That was not forgotten, by the way. Sorry to interrupt.
I didn't know. I didn't. I assumed it wasn't, but I just know that sales are skyrocketing in Europe. It's 70-80% of new bikes sold in Europe are electric bikes, and they're doing really well in the US too. And so I was curious if you'd looked into that and what your thoughts were.
We did. In fact, we very seriously thought about doing a story about that. And in the end, it's frankly a matter of we just did not have the space to get enough. We wanted to make sure we had the space to get depth in a few things.
Yep.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, electric bikes are taking off, and bicycle commuting itself is still growing. The one problem is that is a very urban centric kind of thing. And part of the problem with vehicles is I would bet you the majority of people who are not interested right now in purchasing electric vehicles are people who don't live in cities, or people who live in cities and live in apartments.
Right.
Yeah. One thing I want to mention about your article, Craig, that I really enjoyed was the timeline of electric vehicles over the years. I was quizzing my wife while I was reading your article of just like, hey, honey, when do you think the first electric vehicle to go over 60 miles an hour was invented? And the one that just tickled me to no end was the Trouvé electric tricycle.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where do I go to get on one of those? How do I where do I take one for a spin? Because I'm
tricycle, okay,
yeah.
but not a kid's tricycle.
Sam, I know what you're thinking. Thinking.
No,
I
get it.
Of a tricycle. What this is one giant penny farthing wheel on your left side and two tiny wheels and a battery on your right side. It is a bonkers looking machine.
Yeah, wow. I do not know. I mean, I will say that when we did the electric car road trip, one of the places we ended was the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and we went and looked at the vehicles there, and
the Batmobile.
It's pretty cool. I mean, like some of the very earliest cars were electric, and I love the fact that Ferdinand Porsche was trying to build electric cars because he was so annoyed back in whenever he was so annoyed that the air pollution in Austria was already getting bad, and I think that we in the end we lost out from having an electric future from the get-go because same problem. We couldn't figure out how to charge the vehicles long enough to take cross-country road trips once we started getting decent road systems.
Well, and interestingly, one of the early problems that gas cars had and why people thought electric cars would take off was because you could charge them, power was available, but getting gasoline was a challenge.
Yep.
It's the same problem that electric cars have now. It's like, well, where am I going to charge this thing?
So back to your solar car in the Australian outback, for somewhat obscure reasons, I actually recently rewatched, after 20 odd years, Mad Max 2. And of course, those vehicles are all, whirling around the outback, and they're killing each other in order to get fuel. It would have been cool if they'd added a solar-powered car into the mix that would have freaked everybody out. Something that didn't need the precious juice, the gas.
Yes, the gasoline.
Yeah, the gasoline.
So I've thought about this a lot.
About Mad Max? I actually think Mad Max is brilliant. I got to say, I like it.
It's one of the best climate parables, especially the most recent one.
Yep, absolutely.
Mad Max Fury Road, I think is a brilliant invective of how we handle climate problems and problems of equitable distribution of resources and justice and all these other things. And part of it is part of the reason that George Miller wanted all those cars that he uses, because much of the movie is practical effects,
right?
And part of it is just because, and this gets back to I think my point about like, are gearheads just going to always want a gearhead? Is that because all these old cars will still run after an apocalypse, and it's not clear that the Prius from 1997 is still going to turn on if you try to start it up, whereas the Dodge Charger from 1970 whatever is still going to fire up as long as it's got gasoline.
Yeah, but the precious juice, the gasoline, is going to be a big fight. There's a great helicopter in Mad Max 2 as well, the Gyro Captain, and that's quite a contraption. So
I think what we're saying is all the answers that we need to solve these problems are found in the Mad Max quadrilogy of films.
Yeah, it was something.
Craig, one sort of last thought I have for you is one thing when it came to telecommunications in the developing world, the developing world kind of just leapfrogged over the landline system that we painstakingly built here in the US and other parts of the developed world and just went straight to cell phones.
Yep.
And do you foresee something similar happening with sort of electric vehicle uptake in the developing world, or what are your thoughts there?
100%. I think that is almost certainly what's going to happen. In fact, that very analogy was in a draft of my story, and it got edited out for space. So I think you're absolutely right. I think the idea is that there are, very few. There's certainly almost no brand new vehicles in the developing world, and and so many fewer vehicles, and what there are almost all used, brought in from Europe and Asia. And so I think the idea is if you can get manufacturing at scale in places like Africa and Southeast Asia and parts of South America, then you can actually bypass a lot of the bad things the rest of the world has done to the world. So I do think that's possible. I think the difficulty now is just figuring out a way to do it at scale quickly.
Yep.
That's interesting. And so in the beginning of our discussion, we kind of talked about how you both came about the ideas for your articles separately and then worked on them separately, and then they ended up in this same issue of the magazine side by side. When you got the chance to read each other's articles, were there things that you noticed that were unexpected parallels or unexpected differences? What surprised you about the work that each other had submitted?
Well, I mean, I guess I was both. And Sam is a terrific writer, which means he was very good at being convincing with a really disappointing reality. I mean, I guess I had hoped that what Sam was going to tell me was that the situation might look bleak, but there's great stuff around the corner. And at the same time, nobody wants to hear bad news, but I like being informed. And it sort of erased any of the fiction in my head about how 5 years from now we'll all be flying on electric planes over to London for our family vacations and not have to feel guilty. And I think that's good. We need to face the reality that it's going to be decades before that gets fixed.
Yeah, I had certainly hoped when I started out the reporting that it was going to be somewhat more optimistic. And I do think that humans are amazingly genius at figuring things out. I think we'll get there. I just think it's going to take a long time. And actually, I'll tell you something. When I first saw the cover of the magazine and it said "The revolution is here," I actually thought that's totally true for the Yin story, for Craig's story about what's going on the ground. I kind of think for mine, it was, they're trying to bring the revolution, but it ain't here. It's a ways down the road to be really revolutionary. So, but that's just the reality. I mean, it's a lot harder to, as I say, put a couple hundred people in an aluminum tube and, fly them up to the stratosphere and across an ocean. That's a very difficult thing to do without consuming a huge amount of energy.
It's only difficult if you want to land them safely. If you don't want to get them up there.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. You and your priorities.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm just saying, Joe does a lot of glider work. So
I'm not only a Mad Max fan, I'm a huge Twilight Zone fan. And one of my favorite episodes is where they're flying in the sky, and all of a sudden there's a big turbulence, and the next thing they know, they're going into land at New York, and it's covered by dinosaurs because they've somehow gotten into a time warp. So that could buy us more time if that happens.
I've seen the Gremlin on the Wing one. I've not seen that one, so I'll have to track that one down because that sounds right up my alley.
Now you know who the guy who saw the Gremlin on the Wing is, right?
I do, but I'm blanking on it.
William Shatner,
who just went to space. Yeah. And as far as we know, no gremlins reported.
Did not see a gremlin.
But no wings on that craft. So coincidence?
And he clearly got the memo when he came back and said all the right things about how tremendous it was. I thought it was interesting that when they put Wally, I'm blanking on her last name, but due to be the first woman in space and never got the chance.
Yes.
I thought it was great that they flew her at, the age of 86 or whatever. But she came back and she said, it wasn't that great. I mean, it's kind of, you're only up there for a few minutes, blah, blah, blah. Clearly didn't read the memo that Blue Origin wanted her to say, I guess.
Yeah, but she had actually been waiting for decades, whereas Bill Shatner had been filming stuff and recording albums and hadn't actually, I don't think, ever expected to go to space.
No, that's totally true. Totally.
Yeah. Well, the article, Sam, you wrote is By Air, the Gravity Problem. We should have probably mentioned this up front, but I will mention that the photographs were by David Monteleone, which means mountain lion, which is the best last name I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And Greg, your article was By Land, which gave me Paul Revere vibes. The Big Bet on Clean Cars by Craig Welch, and photographs by David Guttenfelder. And I don't know what that means, but it's a great last name as well. Where else can people find your work and learn about you on the internet? Sam, do you want to tell people?
I have a website, either samhalverhovic.com or jedagebook.com.
And we will link to that in the show notes for this episode. And Craig, what about you?
You can just find me on social media just like you, or nationalgeographic.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much both for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate the time, and I think this was a really great discussion. So thank you for the work in the October issue of National Geographic, The Revolution is Here, and for taking an hour to talk to us this evening.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right, so that was our conversation with Craig Welch and Sam Verhoeven, and we thank them so much for giving us some of their time this evening. It actually was kind of a blessing that the interview even worked out at all. So we're just very grateful to have such a good conversation with them. And I honestly, there are times when we're setting up interviews, Joe, where like I worry that we're going to have to do all the heavy lifting because maybe our guests aren't going to want to chat. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this was not one of those cases.
No, this was not one of those. This was they were happy to talk to each other, and I was like, yes, I'm here for this. I just want to eavesdrop on the conversation the two of you are having, and I'll ask a question when I need to. But other than that, I was delighted by how engaged they were with each other and with us. So thank you both.
Yeah, it was basically podcast inception.
It was great.
Yeah, it was great.
And thanks to Nat Geo for setting up the interview for us and making it all happen. So we really appreciate them reaching out to us to talk to Craig and Sam about this particular issue. But it wouldn't be an episode of Science Sorta if we didn't end things with hearing from our listeners. And they're the real heroes here. So we're going to do that in our next segment, the Paleo Pal. The Paleo Pal is the final segment of the show where listeners send something to us for which we can then respond to. I'm going to start with a comment left on our Facebook page by Mike B, frequent contributor Mike B. We love Mike B. And he commented on our episode 338 with my interview with Arik Kirschenbaum, who wrote The Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy, which is a fantastic book. If you want to basically, do you want to be convinced that if things are evolving on a planet, be it Earth or otherwise, there will eventually be things that evolve that are basically animals as we understand them? Read Arik's book. That's kind of my summary. So, in responding to that plug for the book, Mike says, this is one of the best books that I've read in a very long time. I would define it as being profound. So if you don't appreciate my recommendation, please appreciate Mike's recommendation. I think it's a great one for convincing folks that Arik's book is really good. And it's really convincing that, like, yeah, if you have life evolving on a planet, it's probably going to eventually end up with something that scans to our human understanding as something we would call an animal. And I think that's really cool. Like, I think it is profound. I think that's the right word, is that you can't evolve life without getting something that eventually acts like an animal. So just know that whatever life exists out there in the universe, on other planets, distant planets, far away from us all, there are things that look like dogs that are going to make Joe uncomfortable.
As long as there's something that looks like a cat, it's fine.
Joe, Clementine's so good. Why do you just got to get along with her, man?
I mean, it's a two-way street.
You did great with her.
We'll get there.
All right, good. Joe, what do you got for us?
I have a patron thesis for Bounce B. So if you donate at the Avogadro's Army level?
$6.32 a month. Yeah, that's Avogadro's number. That's correct.
Nice. You have our thanks, as well as you'll get a shout out on a show where we will come up with a very serious thesis with which you can earn your BSSO, your Bachelor's of Science, sort of.
And we're not saying Bounce's last name, but it also is relevant to the drink discussion that we had in the middle of the episode.
It's very on brand. Very on brand.
So I think we can maybe weave that in. We can try. I don't know. What are you thinking, Joe? What's?
I mean, I was gonna. So my going in thought was, don't bounce, a study of alcohol-induced we gotta work it, but alcohol-induced pilot-induced oscillations, PIO. So PIO is when you're coming into land and you start pitch oscillations. So basically like porpoising, and you can crash an airplane that way. And so a PIO caused by alcohol inebriation. And when you do a PIO, you bounce. So and we talked about airplanes, and it all just blends together.
Yeah, can we make an acronym out of like Screech or Owl?
Or eggnog.
Or Whitewater? Or Nog. We could do eggnog. Eggnog, that's interesting.
Nog.
I was thinking, because we talked to a guy who was looking in, we talked to Craig, who was doing like terrestrial transportation, and Sam, who was doing like aviation. I didn't know if there was like some sort of flying car thing we could do for Bounce. What about like not drunk driving, but like drunk falling with style?
That's where I was going to, airborne DUIs.
But like it's the vapors of the alcohol that are filling the Zeppelin that Bounce is piloting.
Or ethanol powered aircraft.
Ethanol vapor filled, like maybe like you're driving along and you're burning ethanol in your combustion engine, and then when you've burned a sufficient amount, you've created enough lighter than air gas to then inflate the balloon, and you take off.
Because it's hot exhaust. Is that the idea?
I mean, people always tell me I'm full of hot air, so
no question.
Don't bounce. And then we got the last name. So maybe there's like a methanogenesis, like fermentation angle.
I mean, yeah, that's where I was pulling in the alcohol.
All right. What about before the colon? Hop to it.
Hop to it.
Because hops.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And bounce. Right. That's obvious.
Yep. Yeah. 100%.
What if it's a mechanism for a terrestrial electric vehicle to go airborne through like a series of hops?
Oh, wait. I mean, okay. So what I was thinking is like a short distance aircraft is ideal for what you could describe as a short hop.
Right.
So you could just say hop to it.
I feel like I've never seen a thesis or dissertation title that included the word study, ironically enough.
Really? How's that possible?
I don't know that I ever have, if I'm thinking about it.
How's that possible?
I don't know. I'm just saying I don't think I've ever seen the word study.
I mean, I believe you.
All right, what do you think of this? Hop to It, a novel implementation of a jump-based method for transitioning from terrestrial to aerial transportation using a methanogenic bladder derived from fungal fermentation of organic biofuels. So like the little craft is like it's jumping, and then once the bladder.
Yeah.
All right. How you doing, Joe? What's on your plate? What do you got going on?
Not a whole lot. Work.
All right.
Work and podcasts.
Well, Joe, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you don't have that much going on. I look forward to defending a tower in virtual reality with you soon.
Yeah, that'll be good.
From ogres and trolls and all manner of mythical being.
It was fun.
It was fun. Science Sort of can be found at sciencesortof.com. We are also on Facebook and Twitter at facebook.com/sciencesortof and twitter.com/sciencesortof. You can find myself and Mr. Joseph on the social medias as well. Twitter.com/Haupt and twitter.com/Batwinnis. Do you have Instagram, Joe?
Also Batwinnis.
Oh man, I didn't get my own name with Instagram, so I'm
lame.
Instagram.com/Ryan Haupt.
Lame.
You know, Haupt is a men's clothing brand in Germany.
I did know that. You've mentioned this. That is very confusing.
I need to order some shirts from them because then I won't have to pay extra for monogramming because they'll already be monogrammed with my correct name.
You really should.
Tell your friends about podcasts in general. Tell them about Science Sort of in particular. Go check out the back catalog of Technically Speaking, which is now available on our SoundCloud page, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I received a message somewhat recently that people were sad that they couldn't go get the backlog of Technically Speaking. It's available on SoundCloud. So if you are, and for free, you don't have to sign up for anything, but it's all available there. And I guess if you like this show, good luck to you. And we'll see you next time for a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
Audio production for Science Sort of is done by Rob Heath at Rob Heath Studios.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Well, it's not. No, Country Roads is not the official West Virginia song.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The official West Virginia song is "Oh, the West Virginia Hills." Oh, the West Virginia hills, how majestic and how grand, with their summits bathed in glory like our Prince Emmanuel's land. Is it any wonder then that my heart with rapture fills as I stand once more with loved ones on those West Virginia hills? Over the hills, beautiful hills, how I love those West Virginia hills. If o'er sea or land I roam, I shall think of merry home with my friends among those West Virginia hills. There are more verses than that, but that's the gist.
It's pretty good.